Mr. Edgerton was suffering from writer's block, a most distressing complaint. The closest he had come to a writing project in the past 6 months was the construction of his weekly grocery list. To complicate matters further, Mr. Edgerton's wallet had begun to feel decidedly lightweight of late, and nothing will dampen a man's ardour for life more than an empty pocket. And so, once again, he found himself wandering the streets of the city, vainly hunting for inspiration, with the wrenching hunger of a beggar seeking scraps for his belly. In time, he came to Charing Cross Road, but the miles of shelved books only depressed him further, especially since he could find none of his own among their number. He was almost at the magistrate's court when something caught his eye in the window of a small antique shop. There, partially hidden behind a framed portrait of General Gordon and a stuffed magpie, was a most remarkable inkpot. It was silver and about 4 inches tall, with a lacquered base adorned by Chinese characters. But what was most striking about it was the small, mummified monkey that perched upon its lid, its clawed toes clasped upon the rim and its dark eyes gleaming in the summer sunlight. It really was a most ghastly creature. But Mr. Edgerton had acquired the civilized man's taste for the grotesque, and he quickly made his way into the darkened shop to inquire about the nature of the item in question. The owner of the business proved to be a veritable fount of knowledge about the items in his possession. The mummified primate was, he informed the writer, an inkpot monkey, a creature of Chinese mythology. According to the myth, the monkey provided artistic inspiration in return for the residues of ink left in the bottom of the inkwell. Although Mr. Edgerton was not by nature superstitious, he was a man profoundly in need of inspiration from any source. He paid over money he could ill afford for the faint hope of redemption offered by the curiosity, and made his way back to his small apartments with the inkpot and its monkey tucked beneath his arm in a cloak of brown paper. That evening, Mr. Edgerton sat at his desk once again and stared at the paper before him, and stared, and stared. After a number of unproductive hours had gone by, their tedium broken only by the spread of an occasional ink blot upon the paper, Mr. Edgerton rose and determined to amuse himself by emptying and then refilling his pen. He reached down and gently grasped the monkey in order to raise the lid, when something pricked his skin painfully. He drew back his hand immediately and examined the wounded digit. A deep cut ran across the pad of his index finger, and blood from the abrasion was flowing down the length of his pen and congregating at the nib, from which it dripped into the inkpot with soft, regular splashes. Mr. Edgerton began to suck the offended member, meanwhile turning his attention to the monkey in an effort to ascertain the cause of his injury. The lamplight revealed a small raised ridge behind the creature's neck, where a section of curved spine had burst through its tattered fur. A little of Mr. Edgerton's blood could be perceived on the yellowed pallor of the bone. The wounded writer retrieved a small bandage from his medicine cabinet, then cleaned and bound his finger before resuming his seat at his desk. He regarded the monkey warily as he filled his pen from the well, then put it to paper and began to write. He wrote long into the night, refilling his pen as required, and so bound up was he in his exertions that he failed entirely to notice that his wound had reopened and was dripping blood onto pen and page, and, at those moments when he replenished his instrument, into the depths of the small Chinese inkpot. Mr. Edgerton slept late the following morning and awoke to find himself weakened by his efforts of the night before. He returned to his desk to find that the inkpot monkey had fallen from its perch and now lay on its back amid the pencils and pens. Gingerly, Mr. Edgerton lifted it from the desk and found that it now weighed considerably more than the inkpot itself, and the physics, rather than any flaw in the inkpot's construction, had played its part in dislodging the monkey from its seat. And then, quite suddenly, Mr. Edgerton felt the monkey move. Its arms and legs stretched wearily, as if it was waking from some long slumber, and its mouth opened in a wide yawn, displaying small, blunt teeth. Alarmed, Mr. Edgerton dropped the monkey and heard it emit a startled squeak as it landed on the desk. It lay there for a moment or two, then slowly raised itself on its haunches and regarded the writer with a slightly hurt expression before ambling over to the inkpot and squatting down gently beside it. Despite his unnerving encounter with the newly animated monkey, Mr. Edgerton put in a most productive day and quickly found himself with the bulk of 5 chapters written, none of them requiring more than a cursory rewrite. It was only when the light had begun to fade and Mr. Edgerton's arm had started to ache that the monkey awoke and padded softly across a virgin page to where Mr. Edgerton's pen lay in his hand. The monkey grasped his index finger with its tiny paws, then placed its mouth against the cut and began to suck. It took Mr. Edgerton a moment to realize what was occurring, at which point he rose with a shout and shook the monkey from his finger. It bounced against the inkpot, striking its head soundly against the base, and lay unmoving upon a sheet of paper. Instantly, Mr. Edgerton was seized with regret at his hasty action. He had endangered the monkey, which he now acknowledged to be the source of his newfound inspiration. Without it, he would be lost. Torn between fear and disgust, Mr. Edgerton reluctantly made his decision. He squeezed together his thumb and forefinger, causing a droplet of blood to emerge from the cut, and then, his gorge rising, allowed it to drip into the monkey's mouth. The effect was instantaneous. The little mammal's eyes opened fully. It rose on its haunches, and then reached for and grasped the wounded finger. There it suckled happily, undisturbed by the revolted Mr. Edgerton, until it had taken its meal, whereupon it burped contentedly and resumed its slumbers. And thus it continued. Each day Mr. Edgerton rose, fed the monkey a little blood, wrote, fed the monkey once again in the evening, wrote some more, then went to bed and slept like a dead man. The monkey itself appeared to require little in the way of affection or attention beyond its regular feeds of blood and the occasional ripe banana. Mr. Edgerton, in turn, decided to ignore the fact that the monkey was growing at quite an alarming rate, so that it was now obliged to sit beside him on a small chair while he worked, and had taken to dozing on the sofa after its meals. In fact, it was not until Mr. Edgerton returned home from a visit to his publisher to find the monkey trying on one of his suits that he began to experience serious doubts about their relationship. He had noticed some new and especially disturbing changes in his companion. It had begun to molt, leaving clumps of unsightly grey hair on the carpets and exposing sections of pink-white skin. It had also lost some weight from its face. That, or its bone structure, had begun to alter, for it now presented a more angular aspect than it had done previously. In addition, the monkey was now over 4 feet tall, and Mr. Edgerton had been forced to open veins in his wrists and legs in order to keep it sated. Yet there were still chapters of the book to be completed, and the writer was reluctant to alienate his mascot. On the 29th day of August, he delivered his completed manuscript to his publisher. On the 4th day of September, which was Mr. Edgerton's birthday, he was gratified to receive a most delightful communication from his editor, praising him as a genius and promising that this novel, long anticipated and at last delivered, would place Mr. Edgerton in the pantheon of literary greats and assure him of a most comfortable and well-regarded old age. That night, as Mr. Edgerton prepared to drift off into contented sleep, he felt a tug at his wrist, and looked down to see the Inkpot monkey fastened upon it, its cheeks pulsing as it sucked away at the cut. "Tomorrow," thought Mr. Edgerton, "tomorrow I will deal with it. Tomorrow I will have it taken to the zoo, and our bargain will be concluded forever." But as he grew weaker, and his eyes closed, the Inkpot monkey raised its head, and Mr. Edgerton realized at last that no zoo would ever take the Inkpot monkey, for the Inkpot monkey had become something very different indeed. Mr. Edgerton's book was published later that year to universal acclaim. A reception was given in his honour by his grateful publishers, to which the brightest lights of London's literary community flocked to pay tribute. It would be Mr. Edgerton's final public appearance. From that day forth, he was never again seen in London, and instead retired to the small country estate that he purchased with the royalties from his great valedictory work. That night, speeches were made, and an indifferent poem recited by one of Mr. Edgerton's new admirers, but the great man himself remained silent throughout. When called upon to give his speech, he replied only with a small but polite bow to his guests, accepting their applause with a gracious smile. And while all those around him drank the finest champagne and feasted on stuffed quail and smoked salmon, Mr. Edgerton could be found sitting quietly in a corner, stroking some unruly hairs on his chest, and munching contentedly on a single ripe banana.